CEO and co-founder at GitLab, and I'm here with Matt Jamo, who the both of us will have a conversation about how to build a great company culture. Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt Jamison. I spent 18 years at Red Hat. I got there when they were a couple hundred people. I was the first help desk employee and then stayed there for 18 years until they were acquired by IBM for $34 billion. So these are some of the lessons that I've learned on how the culture transformed over those 18 years.
Awesome. I would say, Matt, take it away. What are things you've learned?
Yeah, so it's funny. I always try to start a conversation back to the beginning, and in this case, it's actually I went and looked up the definition of culture. I truly didn't know what it was, right? And the dictionary says it's the art or other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. Right. So it's a fancy way of saying is what people collectively come together and agree on. And so the real question then becomes is why is culture important? It's really interesting that, over these years, culture has become so important that, if you think about Red Hat, they have no intellectual property. It's a 100% open source company. And so all they have is a brand and a culture and some facilities, and they got acquired for $34 billion. So companies today are starting to realize that culture is really valuable and really important. And so, with why a culture is important, well, it's just more than money. It's uniting, it's bringing together a common vision. I don't know, have you read the book Sapiens by Noah Harari?
That is a great call out. It's next to my bathtub because that's the book I want to read next.
Oh, it's fantastic. I won't give everything away. But essentially, he talks about humans being social creatures and where common bonds unite us, right? So it starts with, families, where we grew up, all these things. But as we get bigger and as these communities grow, we have to have other identifying bonds that bring us together. And he talks about religions and sports teams and politics, right? It's we hope politics unite us, but it seems to be a little more divisive today. But we'll not get into that. But at the end of the day, to bring a culture together, I really think that we need what I like to call believers, right? To preserve that intended culture. And how do we preserve that? I think the way we do that is, one, we have to define it, and then we have to document it, and then we have to share it, and then most importantly, we have to demonstrate it. And being here at GitLab for, I think, a whopping 5 months now, I kind of want to applaud you on the defining and the documenting of that. We do a fantastic job of documenting for everybody to see exactly what we do. And I'm kind of curious to get your input on why you did that more than, and see if it kind of aligns up with more of a culture idea or if it was just something else.
Yeah. Well, the documentation per se was because I was onboarding someone when we were 9 people, and we just stated the ambition to become a public company, which means most of the companies going public have more than 1,000 people in software. So I'm like, wow, I'm going to be doing this 990 more times. That seems really tedious. Let's start writing things down. And then they've always included our values and the way we communicate as part of that. The communication, because it's really hard to work all remote and a lot of things are not intuitive. So you got to write that down. And the values, because we think it's great to have a shared set of things that you prioritize and kind of a distributed way of making decisions about what is important.
And then why do it publicly?
Yeah, the transparency, that was because we were starting a commercial company around an open source project. And if you're from Red Hat, so you'll know how to appreciate that. Like, there's a lot of concern about things staying open source and around staying a healthy community. And the community was there. We were starting a company, and one way to alleviate some of the concerns and serve kind of also as a way to, it's both like, if you can look inside the company, you can empathize more. Like, the more you know, the more likely you are to like something. But also, if you can look inside the company, you're also able to warn quickly when you see things go off the track. So that's why we started with the transparency. I think we've continued with it both because of that original reason made sense, but also we've seen what it does for attracting people who are bought into how we operate, and making sure that everyone in the company is aware of how we operate. It's just a big lever to have that out there publicly so people can opt in.
Very good. Yeah. As with Linus says, with many eyes, all bugs are shallow, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. So, all right. So kind of getting back to how do you scale this, right? And, we're about 1,500 people now, and, have a vision of 10,000. So, that's easily a 3 to 4x growth. And so, I kind of broke it down into each kind of individual and who does what, right? So we start with corporate leadership, and the way I see the vision of a culture, it starts from on high, right? And in demonstrating it. But at the end of the day, you and I don't get a lot of interaction. And, as we're scaling from 1,500 to 15,000, we will probably have even less. And sadly, that's just the way it is, right? And so you will be stretched even more thin than you are today, and have to be very selective about, how you spend your time. There's only so many hours in a day. So you and the corporate leadership team are giving broad visionary strokes. The next individual I'm going to talk about are the individual contributors, me, right? So I'm a sales guy. I sell to the Air Force. But my influence, it can work, laterally to my peers. And then I can move up to my manager at about one level, maybe two. And then from there, things start to decline of what I have influence over within a company. I would say that being 100% remote even makes that more difficult. And I'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, there's some definite challenges with being an all remote company. Some good, some not so good. And then the third group is I'm going to talk about the managers. And the reason why I saved the managers for last is because this is what we learned at Red Hat. And that is they have the most influence. They influence down to the subordinates. They influence to their peers. And then they can also influence up 1 to 2 levels. And if you think about that as a whole, that's a whole lot of people that they can influence. So with that, we spent a lot of time at Red Hat educating the managers. We created a curriculum that brought the managers in first and basically did culture training. And then, from there, it kind of started to morph to bring everybody in to talk about the culture, because the culture at Red Hat is worth $34 billion, right? So it's very important to them. So let's talk about, for a second, some of the lessons learned and what can go wrong with that. And with that, I kind of break this down into 2 different categories. One is leaders and one is managers. And it's not the proper naming. And I'd love better ideas, because I think, leaders manage and managers lead, right? So there's definitely some, the cross between. But I saw a quote the other day I thought was really neat. It said, leaders do the right things, but managers do things right. And the way I break this down in my head is I love sports, and I've always been fairly active, and I've done a lot of things. And one is play basketball and the other is run marathons. And I've realized that those 2 sports have incredibly different styles of coaching and manager, right? So if I'm a basketball player, I show up to practice, I'm told when practice is, I have a coach. My coach runs everything. He tells, these are the drills we're going to run. We're going to do this and this and this. It's very regimented, right? Within that, he's making me part of a cohesive team and doing everything together. Whereas when I go run a marathon, I get a training plan and I find it or I create it. And then I say, all right, Saturday morning at 6 a.m., I got to get up and I'm going for a 20-mile run. Nobody sets my alarm clock for me. Nobody tells me when to get up. And nobody tells me that I got to do it on Saturday. I just know that I got to go do a 20-mile run. And the styles between the two, I can get a coach, but the coach is not going to be like, regimented like a basketball coach. It's going to be like, how's your training? How do you feel? What can I do to help? Right. And so I kind of equate this to the leaders being the marathon runners and the managers being the basketball coach, if that kind of makes sense. And with that, leaders, they're very visionary. They have all kinds of, crazy ideas. And then managers are very structured and bringing people together. So I'm curious, because in a lot of small companies that have become successful, there's kind of the visionary, the wild-haired guy, and then there's the practical person, right? So you think of like the Jobs and Wozniak, the Gates and Ballmer. And so I'm going to throw this back to you because I'm really curious as to where you see yourself in that, and then who, would you be paired up with?
Yeah. I think it's an artificial distinction. Mm-hmm. To talk with Bill Gates, he wrote the code for the original IBM PC without a single flaw in it, without having a prototype handy. So, yes, he didn't get involved. He let Ballmer run, kind of go to market to a huge extent. But I think you need a lot of information, of the nitty gritty, to be a good leader. Like, for example, we are talking about, hey, when talking about something, like the more you need some of that detailed information in order to make the right decision on a high level. So I don't think of like Steve Jobs cared about the color of the icon of Gmail on the phone. Like, it's trivial. So I don't think there's this broad strokes. I think you need to be involved in a lot of details to be able to paint the right broad strokes.
Sure. Yep. Thank you. So kind of the next lesson I learned is where is your time spent? Are you promoting new and risky ideas, or are you climbing the corporate ladder? And I truly got this idea at the start of the pandemic. I reached out to the VP of Red Hat and I said, I'm low on my reading list. What do I read? And he said, read Loon Shots. I'm like, okay, I'll read Loon Shots. It's by Safi Bakhal. It wasn't the best book that I've read, but it did have something very interesting in it that I really latched onto. And he talks about as you're a growing company, you're taking really risky ideas because you have no other choice but to do that. And then as you grow and morph, you start to become settled in and, bringing in the revenue of those risky ideas. And then your risky ideas start to kind of fade away and take a back seat. But more importantly, what happens with the culture of that? And the culture becomes, you have the two kinds of employees, and you have the employees that still want to take risk and take those loon shots and take risky ideas. And then you have the other employees that are focused more on business and climbing the corporate ladder. So he brought up an example in the book and he said, if you finish your job in 7 hours and you have 1 hour left, what do you do with that hour? Do you go and try to come up with an innovative idea and collaborate with others, or do you spend it climbing up the corporate ladder? And I thought it was a very interesting concept because I saw that firsthand, at Red Hat, taking all kinds of innovative ideas. I was there when we moved from Red Hat Linux to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and we pissed off the community and we did all these things, right? But we had to take these risky ideas in order to grow the company. There's just plenty of examples over the years of that happening. But then, I saw things becoming more settled in and people working to climb up the corporate ladder. Um, so I'm curious as to get your shot or your thoughts and ideas of where you think we might be in that transformation. And it's not always a transformation, right? Every company can do both. But I'm curious as to where you see that, or if you've even thought about that idea.
Yeah. In software, companies that are led by their former founders tend to be more successful. And there's two reasons for that. It is because those founders still remember the reasons for making decisions in the first place, and therefore having a much easier time kind of changing course, because they know why things are the way they are. So they have insight of when circumstances change and you have to change something. If you don't know where the supporting walls are, it's much harder to go change a building. The second thing is because they have a lot of trust in the company. So if they make a decision, they're gonna get more leniency from the company. The company's prepared to put up with more from them than from someone else. So it's not about the risk taking. If that was true, you could have an innovative company, the co-founder would leave, you could put a new, very risk-taking entrepreneurial person in that seat and they'd be successful. That is not what history tells us. So I think it's about more than just risk-taking. I think it's about the historical knowledge and the credit you get from the rest of the company.
No, I would absolutely agree with that. One of the things I would say is, to kind of at the lower level of kind of beware of, you've got the corporate players and they tend to do a really good job and they often tend to get promoted as the company grows. And they get promoted over, your loon shotters, right? And then what does that happen to the loon shotters? It's like, oh, well, I don't do a good job playing the corporate game, but I do a really good job at innovating and fixing things and making things better, but that's not working for me. So therefore, I either go to a smaller company to where my innovative ideas happen, or I can, quit, or I can play the corporate game, right? And start focusing on climbing up the corporate ladder. Now, all of a sudden, your innovators aren't innovating anymore, right? Which I find to be quite interesting.
I agree with that, and that's why every promotion at GitLab is according to our values. With that being said, there's still a natural motion as a company gets bigger for there to be less appetite for risk.
Yeah,
and I think it's really important to keep recognizing people who had kind of a disproportionate positive impact, and to be accepting of taking risk, and not focusing on things that went wrong or failures as a way to kind of stimulate careers. It should be almost completely focused on what people did right, as long as it's not affecting other people.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yep. All right. So one of the next things that I learned was beware of empire builders and Kool-Aid drinkers. I've seen some people come up through the ranks. They're really great, but they tend to focus on how they can build their own empire within the company. And conversely, right, you've got your Kool-Aid drinkers, and they're really, really passionate. And I can tell you right now that, I drank the open source Kool-Aid, and I drank it when it was really strong, and I still am a very passionate person. And I need to say, beware of the Kool-Aid drinkers, because their passion can be infectious and can also, influence unduly, right? So those are just kind of the two things that, they can both be right, they can both be wrong, and they both have their place, but just, kind of beware of those two types of people. One of the next things I learned was do not fear conflict. Have you read the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team or know about that?
Actually, on our values page, it's called out, and it's been called out by me years ago of how our values address the 5 dysfunctions in a team.
Yeah. So, I will just say, let's defer to that and then move on. But yeah, it's really important unless you want to quickly cover it.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's go to the values page, because I think with that in hand, I'll do a better job. So you have the absence of trust, and we're trying to prevent that with collaboration, specifically kindness. You have the fear of conflict, and we're trying to prevent that with transparency, specifically directness and collaboration, and short toes in collaboration. If the lack of commitment, we're trying again to prevent that by transparency and directness. You have the avoidance of accountability. That's prevented by results, iteration, and transparency. You have the inattention to results, and that's prevented by, guess what? Results. So we're trying to make sure that our values address these concerns.
Yep. Perfect. The next thing that I learned in a rapidly growing company was foster, don't fire, to a point, right? I'm a 23-year military veteran. I retired a few years ago from the Air Force Reserves, and one of the things that we always have is you go into battle with the army that you have, not the army that you want, right? So this goes back to, who are the influencers in our company? And if it truly is, getting the most bang for our buck from our influencers, and that's our managers, then spend some time cultivating and training them, in our culture and the way we want the culture to be influenced, right? And I say, we identify our leaders and we identify our managers early and ensure that they're in the right positions. I know in sales, for me, it's much more of a leadership style. I'm given a quota and I'm told, here's your marching orders, or, what we call commander's intent, right? Here's my intention for you to go win this mission, go, right? And then check back every so often. Whereas, certain other organizations, we need managers. We need somebody to say, all right, this is how we do things. This is what we do on a 9 to 5. And here are the ideas that I have. If you have a manager in a leadership position, they don't do so well. And, conversely, the other way around. So, identify, who are your leaders and who are your managers, and make sure that they're in the right positions for that. Let's see. I have in my notes here a funny story about this. So this is 2002, and the CEO Matthew Zulik came up to me and he said, JMO, he goes, this was as a help desk, by the way. He said, how many people do we have here running Windows in the Raleigh office? And I'm like, think about this, 2002, right? And I said, I don't know, Matthew, maybe 20 or 30. And he said, all right. He goes, go up to them. And these are like a bunch of executives and everything. He's like, go up to them and tell them that they have 30 days to get off of Windows and get onto Linux. And if they don't, you come tell me who they are. And then I will go up to them and tell them that perhaps we've made a poor hiring decision. I'm like, okay. So my job for the next couple of months was figuring out who in the company justifiably needed Windows. And then the rest of them, it was time to get on board. And that was the passion, right? That was the fuel and the fire and everything else. And I think at the time he was trying to, kind of foster the passion that I had to exude, with everyone else in the company. But it was, it was very interesting that I can see my footprints in my handprints on, something, in a small company. But as we grew, I kind of went through the phases of who are you and what have you done with my company versus, yeah, we're just a big company now. One of the ways to do that is, foster what you have, and then move along. One of the things that, I read, I don't know, some book, but it was, somebody makes a mistake, and it's like, do you punish that mistake, or do you realize that is a very valuable lesson that you've learned? Do you make the $100,000 error, or did you learn the $100,000 lesson? And I'm curious as to what your point of view is on that one within the company.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of connotations to your running Windows story. First of all, at GitLab, we tell you to only use Linux and Mac, because on Windows there's higher incidence of malware and things like that. Still, 5% of the sign-ons to Okta aren't through Windows machines. So we still need to get to the bottom of that. And that could be even people needing to sign on to the ADP portal to download their salary slips on the computer they're filing their taxes with. So it might not be GitLab work, but still have to look into that.
If you need help, let me know.
I'm not, well, I have one Windows machine, but it's for gaming, not for taxes. The second thing is, I think I appreciate the story. At GitLab, I think if I heard a manager saying something like, I think it has to be tongue in cheek. If you say, I think if that's the case, maybe we've made the right hiring decision. I assume it is. I've also learned that a job is super fundamental to people's lives, and kind of flippantly referring to like hiring decisions or potential letting people go or offboarding is not great. So if I catch myself saying that, I'd appreciate if someone would say Sid, that's not fair. Third, it's super effective to dog food. My hope would be that those people who are forced to switch to Linux, I hope they don't drink that might be violent. So, but I hope they don't I hope they reluctantly do that and start complaining about everything.
Yep.
Yeah. Because that's where the magic happens. Those Windows users, and they come on and they say, why is my audio a little bit broken if I use a Linux machine? Like it's a trope by now, like audio working on Linux. And it's not because it's working so well. And that's what you need. And every time we start using something at GitLab ourselves, whether it's code owners or geo or advanced search or things like that, we find bugs that we could have found earlier if we would have used it earlier ourselves. So dog fooding, I think, is essential. And I don't want to kind of shame people in embracing the product. That makes me think of Ballmer getting upset when he saw an iPhone. I think those people who have kind of taste to buy that product, I would be if someone was walking around with, if someone at GitLab was using GitHub instead, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. I'd love for you to use GitLab. So but please do complain and don't hesitate to compare the two, because there's probably a good reason why you're doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of the last few sales holdouts still running Linux at Red Hat. And it's just, because it's what I was comfortable with. And I would always I'd challenge everybody. I said, why are you running a Mac? And it's like, well, it just works. And I said, that's an invalid argument. It's like, because I need you running Linux and I need you complaining. I need you telling somebody what's wrong. It's like, I know you can't write code. I know you can't do that. But what I do know you can do is submit a bug if there's something wrong. And if you're not doing that, then who is? Because now there's nobody left in the community. And if there's nobody left in the community, what's the point? So, all right. The last few minutes that we have, one of the last couple of things that I've learned is you got to play the infinite game. Have you read that book by Simon Sinek?
I've not.
It is a fantastic book. I'm a huge Simon Sinek fan. He's got a few books. One's Leaders Eat Last. It's the Marine Corps mantra. I don't know if you know, but in the Marine Corps, when they line up for chow, it's always the lowest ranking eat first to the highest rank. And it's not anywhere written down in the Marine Corps doctrine. It's just the way it is. And so therefore, the name of the book is Leaders Eat Last. And then there's another one starts with Y. And then his newest one is one of the best ones that I've read. It's called The Infinite Game. He talks about a finite game being a basketball game, for example, and then an infinite game being a business, right? If we do everything right, GitLab will survive you and I, and it will continue to grow. And so therefore, are we making decisions that impact something more than a quarterly earnings report? And honestly, since you and I are having this discussion, I fear when we go public that we now have to appease analysts on a quarterly number versus an annual number or an infinite number, right? Of what the goal is and what that target is. And I'm curious if you have contemplated that at all.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, well, first of all, the stock purchases are really smart, and they can reward companies for investing in the long term. For example, a lot of analysts, when evaluating the profit and loss of a company, they don't look at R&D expense because it's an investment in the future. So they scrutinize, goes to market, G&A costs, stuff like that. But R&D, they kind of make the assumption, well, that's investing in the future, so that's a good thing. So if you are predictable, if we are predictable as a company, we can set expectations correctly and we can keep investing in the long term. And in moonshots, I have to say it because it's in your background, but yeah, we're investing in Meltano now. That's not a next quarter thing. And there's tons of decisions. The amount of R&D money we're spending is not for next quarter. That's for in 5 years and 10 years to win the category. I do think there's something to setting goals and really trying to meet them. When we were a small startup at Y Combinator, we set a goal of 10% growth every week. And that was super helpful. It helped us focus. So there's something to it. But we've also all seen the stories of the quarterly goals becoming the only goal, and short-term, long-term trade-offs, which are ever present in the business. So that's super hard. I'm not sure how we're going to solve it. A lot of it is being predictable, because if you are predictable, you have fewer mishaps, and that helps. It's also a lot about communication. Like if I and Paul can effectively communicate to shareholders why we're making certain investments, and there's going to be more acceptance of them. But there's certainly a risk. There's an elevated risk. And that's something we knew when we accepted external investment. It changes the course of the company. But I think there's a ton of companies that are playing long games. Apple, Amazon, Tesla, SpaceX come to mind, where SpaceX is private. The other 3 companies are public. So it is possible. But I'm not sure I'm as good of a manager as the people there. If we do become public, we're going to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm encouraged to see what the results are going to be. And I appreciate the fact that you're open and willing to learn. So the last thing that I have is, read this from a book called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. He's a former Navy SEAL. And he says there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. People leave bad managers, not bad companies. They also leave bad leaders too. But, with that being said is, I believe that, a culture is everyone's responsibility. And, if that culture starts to break down in small areas, then the people that are underneath that breakdown don't believe that anymore. And then, what's left, right? Then we're just like any other company. But with that, we got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to see if you had any questions, and I'll let you close out.
Yeah. Don't have questions. I do want to agree with you. Like, I think the manager or the leader, and when a team is not functioning, that's on the manager or the leader. I think we've not had any instances where we just hired a whole team full of people that weren't a fit for the role. So almost always it's a reflection of that leader. Even if it wasn't, like, it's really hard to replace the whole team. Like, so it's like in soccer, like if the results are bad, the coach goes, even though it might not be the coach.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think everything you called out in this meeting are things to pay attention to. So I want to thank you for sharing your insights. It was really great hearing them, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Likewise.